this book seems, be written to probably Protestant, Catholic Christians. Where does, one category I was thinking that could fit in here is, as kind of a final category, maybe with missiology, is ecclesiology. How does the church itself as a whole approach this idea?
Yeah, good question. So, I would say one of the most important realities, especially facing us as Baptists, is we draw a really big distinction around the church from the world. That, we don't believe in believers' I'm sorry, we believe in believers' baptism.
This is being recorded, just so you know.
We don't believe in infant baptism. That one is not merely kind of absorbed by osmosis into the church. One has to make a conscientious declaration and voluntary profession to enter the church. And that language of someone's conversion being voluntary means that you haven't been coerced. It means it's an authentic reality that you have grasped voluntarily, without coercion, without being lured, without being blackmailed. And so that's one component of how ecclesiology fits into this, as far as just membership in the church itself. But then just more broadly speaking, for us to understand what the church is, we have to understand that it's distinct from the world. And so we have to have kind of institutional boundaries so that the world and the church don't become kind of porously enmeshed with one another, but that there are clear boundaries to know what is the church, what is the world, what is the state.
Yeah, that's helpful. So how do we think through what some have called, I think Rod Dreher a while back, we're approaching a kind of a post-religious world. How do we think through that when we think about religious freedom? So if, quote unquote, religion is kind of going out the door, maybe this is where your introduction, we all worship something. Maybe does that play into that idea?
Yeah. So, I try to make the case in the book that whether you're religious or not, everyone is unwittingly relying on these categories of religious liberty. So in the book, I talk about the 3 A's of religious liberty: authority, adoration, and authenticity. Every single person, even if you're not Christian, are relying on those 3 categories. And so a part of the book, even though it's not written for non-Christians, my hope is for Christians to have a better understanding of why the categories of religious liberty still matter to the broader world that we operate within, because religious liberty, it operates within the broader ecosystem of just liberty itself. And one of the biggest principles, just more broadly with liberty, is liberty is the freedom to do what one ought, not necessarily what one wants. And so we make room for people to have error in their misconstruals of liberty. And the reason that we give room for people to be to have wrong conclusions about certain things is because in an American context, I think this is actually right, the burden is on the government to step in and say when they need to restrict your religious liberty. We don't have to actually justify our liberty to the United States government. The presumption is you have liberty to do what you want up until your liberty poses a threat to public safety or public health. And so I think this is an example where we can say to kind of the broader non-Christian audience, we may disagree with your understanding of liberty and how you want to choose to live your life. And there could come a time where the government has to restrict your liberty and religious liberty for that matter. But we are still kind of reciprocally bound up in protecting each other's liberty, because especially in a context like an American context where we have rights, our rights are they're reciprocal. Like my rights are your rights are my rights. And so hopefully we can begin to create an ecosystem where we can say like, all right, if you disagree with me, fine, just don't banish me. That's the problem with secular understandings of liberty is if you believe that your understanding of the ideal society can be brought about into the present, if you're a kind of a secular materialist progressive, you lose the ability to have a principled case for religious liberty. And that's why, like, I don't think it's any shock or surprise whatsoever that we're seeing a decline in religious liberty alongside a decaying understanding of civil liberty. You know, I no doubt we have good jurisprudence protecting religious liberty and political liberty, but at the level of like elite liberal society, you have the rise of cancel culture, right? You have a growing antipathy to religion. And I just don't think that's coincidental. I think they're bound up with each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful when you think about the reciprocal nature of, you know, the churches or individuals' religious liberty, that there is freedom and that the government kind of decides when you're knocking on that. I guess that, you know, one of the most pertinent issues is just the mass worship, you know, gathering in places of worship now. So you would say that is exactly kind of what you're talking about, where this issue kind of came to the fore, you know, recently.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a, man.
And I know that's a complicated
yeah,
topic, but it's all on everybody's mind right now because that's been what's been.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you kind of how I've processed this, because it was an interesting experiment in kind of understanding religious liberty in real time. So like when March of 2020 hits, like we're being told by our governing officials that like literally millions of people are going to die. And so therefore, like there's this kind of mass hysteria of, yeah, I think everyone at the time was more or less saying, in this dire situation, the state has rightful authority to call a halt to church services out of interest, public health interest and public safety interest. What I think we learned as time went on, and please hear me, I'm not trying to make light of COVID at all. What I think we learned as time went on is that things weren't as dire as maybe we were first told, even as serious as it was. And so I think as we learned more about the virus, it helped us then reevaluate what the government was doing and saying as regards public meetings and public gatherings. And so I think I do think, let me say this, however you fall on kind of meeting, not meeting during COVID, like I think the government went too far in some portions of its declarations in kind of decreeing that it had kind of absolute power to shut down churches. And then you had in Kentucky, for example, the governor writing down the license plates of people who were attending Easter services, which is just absolutely extreme, and however you interpret it. But then we saw something really, I think, helpful happen later in the fall when the surge happened. You had governors, and this happened in Kentucky, the governor of Kentucky stopped issuing like declarations of like executive authority closing down churches. He was asking churches to shut down, requesting. And I think that was a helpful clarifying thing, because there was this massive debate, and I don't pretend to have it all figured out right now. Like the church has its own liberty. It does not exist under the umbrella of the state. But at what point should we not meet in order to not pose a risk to public safety? And that's where prudence comes in. And anyone here who thinks that's an easy answer is deceiving themselves. So I think, you know, one of the best things you can say in these types of situations where some type of conflict emerges and you have to make a decision, all you can say is based on what we know right now. So I think in March and April, churches were making the right decisions in closing their doors based on what they knew then. Now we know more. And I mean, personally speaking, people on here can disagree with me. I don't think churches need to close their doors. I think that we've figured out safe, cautious ways to meet that rule out the need to completely shut down churches. That's a long-winded answer. I'm gonna wrap it up there.
No, I think that's helpful, and it's kind of the question that came up on everybody's mind at some point. What to do. So related to that, are there any other kind of boundaries you see being pushed on both sides of what should be in religious, like, allowed in this category of religious liberty versus government overreach? That more broadly, not necessarily, like the COVID situation right now, but just kind of trends that you've seen in the last 5-6 years.
Well, I mean, obviously the big debate right now is issues of sexuality and religious liberty.
Yep.
We saw actually, it's timely that you're asking this question. Over the weekend, it was announced in Finland that charges of incitement have been brought against the bishop-elect of the Lutheran Church in Finland because the bishop oversaw the publication of a pamphlet merely upholding what the church has taught about sexuality for 2,000 years. And I think that's a very, very ominous reality because this whole notion of incitement is this idea that what you're doing is going to cause imminent harm and danger if you dare do this or say that. And so to the extent that we have a legal system that kind of buys into this, what we call dignitary harm argument, that the mere proclamation of words that homosexuality is sinful, if that's ever received as intrinsically harmful to one's dignity, that could be couched and accused of incitement, which could lead to the restriction on certain liberties, especially even inside the church, hypothetically. That's very, very, very concerning. In fact, I lack the vocabulary right now to say how concerning that is, because we are living increasingly in this culture that you can't dare offer a dissenting opinion for the dissenting opinion being accused of harming someone by merely offering up words. If we live in a society where words themselves are dangerous, you are going to have liberty eclipsed eventually.
Yeah. Does that relate to your epilogue? You talked about liberal democracy and religious liberty. Are you using liberal as in the political?
Yeah, not like liberalism left, but like liberal democracy, ordered liberty, constitutionalism.
Yeah. Good. So I'm interested. Were you a Baptist? So you say how religious liberty made me a Baptist.
Yeah.
Were you a Baptist before, and this just confirmed?
Yeah. So this is the thing I kind of want to shout from the rooftops at Southern Seminary is like I graduated from Southern with my MDiv, and like I was Baptist because like I believed you needed to make a verbal proclamation or confession of who Christ is. And I was Baptist because we believed in the Bible, right? It's believe the Bible, what Baptists believe. Well, it was actually getting out of seminary where I still would have called myself a Baptist, that where I studied religious liberty, that made me more passionately Baptist. Because to be a Baptist means that you understand to be a part of the church, to be a Christian is to make a verbal confession of faith. It's conscientious, it's voluntary. It's to join a church united and covenanting around certain ideals that are not of the world. And so to me, Baptist ecclesiology is kind of the natural outworkings or byproduct of what I understood to be a correct doctrine of religious liberty.
So you read your Bible.
I read my Bible. Yeah, that's